For the fourth and final part of this section on the American presidency, we're going to finish up with what I'm going to call odds and ends. Questions that we'll be talking about here. Is the presidency these days too imperial or too weak? That's an ongoing debate. What about the office of the vice presidency? What's going on with that exactly? What might we say about that? We're going to talk about John Locke's concept of executive prerogative versus legislative supremacy. We'll talk about the role of the president as the head of his or her political party and what the implications of that are politically. We'll talk about executive privilege. And then finally, we'll talk about the two presidencies thesis. So we'll get through this as quickly as we can. I'll make it as painless as I can. Let's get started. Very quickly, because it's a debate that I've already made reference to. Some believe that the presidency has grown too powerful in the modern era, the imperial presidency, as Schlesinger calls it. Others continue to claim that perhaps the presidency is too weak. It is an ongoing debate. Again, Vice President Dick Cheney almost certainly had a huge impact on the Bush presidency after 9/11. He had believed that under Clinton, the presidency had grown too small. He thought it should be much more powerful. And I think he was pretty successful in helping to bring about that agenda post 9/11. If you believe, as the consensus is, I think by and large, that it perhaps has become too powerful, what are the remedies? Hard to say. I would say that structurally, in terms of the way the world is evolving, getting smaller over time, the fact that the U.S. is a global superpower, the global superpower, and the size and complexity of the economy, all of these things seem to structurally favor a more powerful executive branch, not just here but elsewhere in any democratic nation state. So these larger changes, I think, are so powerful. I'm not sure that too much can be done about this possibility of an imperial presidency. If one believes, however, that there are changes that need to be made, it seems to me the most likely sources of some sort of remedy to an imperial presidency would come from the other two branches of the federal government. We would need a reassertive Congress. Although we've seen, right, that when Congress asserts itself, we often find that to be unimpressive, unpleasant, and worrisome. Whether it's John Boehner or Mitch McConnell or Harry Reid, we would hardly say that these are people leading a charge by a popular institution. And to succeed in American politics at some level, you have to be popular. Congress, we know, is not all that popular. And also, Congress does a generally lousy job in foreign policy. A great debating society, good at deliberating endlessly, not so good at acting quickly and efficiently and somewhat secretively to get things done on the world stage, where the name of the game is realpolitik, Machiavellian politics. The Supreme Court, maybe. The court has some power here to limit executive authority. We'll see that they've done so in several cases, like versus W. Bush in terms of his treatment of the detainees at Guantanamo Bay, vis-a-vis some of Clinton's claims about immunity from civil litigation. We'll see that the court did also limit the executive authority of Harry S. Truman in Youngstown v. Sawyer, a few other cases. But don't expect too much from the court. Remember, the president has the power of the sword, the Congress the power of the purse, the court only the power to persuade. So if a president is determined, they can always ignore the court's decisions, like in Brown v. Board of Education for about 10 years. What about the vice presidency? Is it, as one wag has claimed, worth a warm bucket of spit, which presumably is not worth a whole heck of a lot on the free market, or is it something more than that? I would say historically, a warm bucket of spit is probably a pretty good estimation of the value of that office. I would say this: the value is highly discretionary to the sitting president. If the sitting president wishes the vice president to be significant and influential, that will happen. Albeit historically, mostly presidents have not wanted the vice president to be very significant, so they've tucked them away in a back room somewhere. Sarah Palin did once say that if she were elected vice president, she would run the U.S. Senate. The U.S. Senate was very surprised to hear that. They didn't realize that was in the Constitution. Oh, turns out it's not in the Constitution. The Constitution does specify that the vice president can preside over the U.S. Senate, but it turns out Senate rules have made it very clear the vice president can be there, but they cannot speak, they cannot debate, they cannot engage in any sort of back and forth with senators. Understandably, the Senate feels like, what are you doing here? You're from the executive branch. We don't hang out in the Oval Office when the president is making big decisions. What are you doing here? So the Senate, understandably, has never received that very well. Now, that being said, what can the vice president do constitutionally? If there is a tied vote in the U.S. Senate, the vice president can cast the tie-breaking vote. That happens maybe a half a dozen times every 4 years or so at most. These days it doesn't seem to happen at all. So in those cases, the vice president will be brought in and they will cast a tie-breaking vote. That can make a difference in those rare cases where it happens. So if Palin had been elected vice president, God forbid, I think she would have been a little disappointed given that she thought she was going to rule over the U.S. Senate. All right, now, we would say that historically, again, vice presidents have been worth roughly a warm bucket of spit, much to their consternation and disappointment. Truman was nominated by FDR to be his running mate, but FDR made it very clear, I'm the big man here, I'm the big kahuna, who the heck are you? I used you perhaps to help me win Southern votes or something like that. Talk to FDR's hand because FDR don't understand, not interested. LBJ, the same thing. He was chosen by John F. Kennedy. Imagine those two together in a room. Awkward, right? The patrician, aristocratic New England Yankee, John F. Kennedy, highly educated. Lyndon B. Johnson, a little rough around the edges. A guy from Texas. Went to a very modest school. Was rough, really rough around the edges. Yeah, so John F. Kennedy made it very clear, hey, I used you to help win Southern votes, but you will have no significant role in my presidency. Forget about it. So in general, that's been the trend. Now, that being said, right, we know that in the case of both Truman and LBJ, they went from being worth a warm bucket of spit one day to being the most powerful person on the planet the next day. So in those cases, the vice president ended up being very powerful because they became president by dint of their boss passing away while in office. In the first case, of course, FDR, and in the second case, John F. Kennedy being assassinated. I think FDR had passed away while he was with his mistress down in Georgia at his vacation home. I believe it was a massive stroke. But given his health issues, it wasn't surprising to anybody. And Truman went, again, from being a warm bucket of spit to being the man. So in that sense, the vice president potentially can be extremely powerful. Now, that being said, do we have recent examples that suggest an alternative trend? Yes, we do. I would say Clinton with Al Gore. Clinton gave Gore significant responsibilities as VP. He gave him, I believe, his environmental policy portfolio and at least part of his foreign policy portfolio. So Gore was a very significant vice president. I would not say co-president, but a significant vice president. Dick Cheney, the next vice president, took that, I think, a whole lot further. He became, I believe, and I think it's not even contested by historians, Cheney became our most powerful vice president. Why was he recruited to run as vice president under W. Bush? Because W. Bush had no significant foreign policy experience. So once foreign policy became the focus of the Bush White House post 9/11, Cheney became the man. No serious question about it. From 9/11 to the end of Bush's first term, Cheney seemed to be in control of American foreign policy to a very high degree. And that also became part of our domestic policy through things like the Patriot Act. Ongoing questions about who was really the president during some of those years after 9/11. Obviously, technically, Bush was, and maybe in reality, but Cheney certainly was A very, very powerful, very influential vice president during those years. Now, by Bush's second term, Bush had become more skeptical of Cheney, felt like Cheney had given him a lot of bad advice. Can you say weapons of mass destruction? Uh, and so Cheney became more marginal in Bush's second term. But in his first term, post 9/11, super influential, unprecedented, really. And then Joe Biden under Barack Obama, and in some ways similar, similar or not to Dick Cheney. Why did Obama choose Biden? Because Obama had no significant experience in foreign policy. Biden had a ton in the Senate. Has Biden become as powerful as Cheney? Only in Biden's dreams. I would say that Biden has been a significant vice president, but not as significant as Dick Cheney. So the last three vice presidents have been significant beyond just stepping up if the president dies. Cheney was the most significant without question. Is this a long-term trend? We won't know until the next president. But we do see three in a row that were significant. We'll see what the future holds on that count. What about the concept of executive privilege? Executive privilege is the idea that certain conversations within the White House must be protected from scrutiny by Congress, by the media, by the courts, by any outside parties. The idea being that in order to have these vigorous conversations within the White House regarding politics and policy, the participants in those discussions need to feel free to take a wide range of positions, to take controversial arguments and put them right out there, right? Because that's really the best way to arrive at a good policy, is lay everything out on the table, discuss it all, propose things that might seem a little crazy, see how it goes, a whole lot of back and forth, right? And the idea is, look, if participants in these discussions believe that every single word they say is going to be looked at by others, is going to be reviewed by the media, reviewed by Congress, taken out of context by Congress, utilized against them by the courts, those conversations will be very formal, very limited, very stilted, very ineffective. So the idea is there should be some notion of executive privilege, right? How far does that go? The court has said that indeed executive privilege, although not specifically mentioned in Article 2 of the Constitution, is constitutionally based. For the president to be an effective president, he or she needs to keep certain conversations within the White House confidential. No question about that. Nixon invoked this concept, however, in the case of U.S. v. Nixon, circa 1974. The basic question was that these White House plumbers had been found breaking into Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. There was some suspicion that they may have had some connection with the Nixon White House, and so the court in that case that was considering the criminal indictment of these so-called plumbers that had broken into private offices, the court said, "Hey, you know what, Nixon? We would very much like to see or hear the tapes that you've made about conversations within the Oval Office regarding this particular issue. We want the evidence. We think it's important in this trial. It's a criminal trial. Their liberty is at risk. We want that information. We want the tapes." Nixon said not just no, but hell no. He provided some bogus edited versions of the tapes. And ultimately, Nixon said, "Hey, look, I cannot give you everything that you ask for. It's covered under executive privilege. It involves national security. Don't mess with me." And by the way, people, take a look at that link. I've never noticed this before. Look at the argument that James St. Clair makes on behalf of the president, right? He says something like, the president wants me to argue that he has the same powers as King Louis of France, that he has absolute monarchical power and is not subject to any court, right? So apparently that's what Nixon told him to argue. So St. Clair makes that argument, right? He represents his client, but he distances himself from that argument, understandably, right? He doesn't say, I believe. He says, the president wants me to argue. I'm like, wow. Talk about selling your client down the river a little bit. And yet, thank heavens he did, right? Because the argument that Nixon wanted him to make was ridiculous, really disturbing. If you're looking for evidence of an imperial presidency, you certainly see it there. So take a close look at that. I would strongly suggest it. The court rightly says, heck, that's bogus. If it was something to do with national security and it needed to be protected, all right, but you're not making that case. And what you seem to be arguing really is that you are a monarch and that what you say goes, and we should take your word for it. Heck no. What we think it really involves Nixon security, not national security. So Nixon was forced to surrender the tapes. The tapes revealed conversations about the break-in. Nixon was implicated in at least a cover-up of those break-ins, and that's what ultimately led to his resignation. So the court did say executive privilege, yes, but unlimited executive privilege, no. Executive privilege, if you can defend it in a rational, reasonable way. But executive privilege to protect yourself, no, that's not going to cut it. So we've talked about executive privilege. I want to distinguish that from executive prerogative. Executive prerogative is an idea advanced by John Locke back in the late 1600s. And John Locke, in general, favored legislative supremacy, something roughly akin to what the Founding Fathers desired, which was a Congress that was first among equals. But, Locke said, during times of crises, when the nation is under threat of annihilation, you can have executive prerogative. An executive that can act above the law, beyond the law, even against the law, to save the republic. Once the republic has been saved, return to normalcy, go back to legislative supremacy. So John Locke does carve out the possibility of an exceptionally strong executive, but only under those very particular conditions. Some argue, however, that once the toothpaste is out of the tube, once the executive has that much power, sometimes it's hard to get the toothpaste back into the tube. I've tried. It is damn near impossible. We've talked about this. We've had particular presidents that were really powerful, like Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt. But once they were done with their particular crises, the tube took the toothpaste back inside. Some argue, however, since FDR, we have not been able to get the toothpaste back into the tube, that strong executive has become structurally advantaged by shifting world conditions and the creation of a large welfare state. And especially maybe since 9/11, with an ongoing, apparently endless war on terror, right? If we're constantly in a war, we're constantly in crises, the nation is under constant threat of annihilation, we have constant executive prerogative. That's the concern of some, is that the conditions that Locke laid out as exceptional have become normal, and that's created ongoing long-term executive prerogative. That's part of that debate over, do we have an imperial presidency or do we not? Let us talk ever so briefly of the role of president as head of his or her party. No question about it. Who do we consider today to be the head of the Democratic Party? It is Barack Obama. When W. Bush was president, who was head of the GOP? W. Bush. When Ronald Reagan was president, Ronald Reagan. All right, so for the party that controls the White House, the question of leadership is very easily answered. It's the president. If the president is popular, that's an advantage for members of the president's party, right? So in 2008, Obama's popularity was an advantage for Democrats running for Congress and state legislatures and so on. That's the advantage. The disadvantage is when the president is no longer popular. Barack Obama in 2010, Barack Obama in 2014. That's really why Republicans won all the statewide offices at the executive level in Nevada and won big majorities in both houses of the legislature here. It was really because of Obama's relative lack of popularity. So you live by the sword, you die by the sword. When you hold the White House and the president is popular, your party benefits. when you hold the White House and your president is unpopular, you definitely get hurt by it politically. What happens to the party that does not have control of the White House? There, it's kind of a melee. It's what we see right now in the Republican nomination process for the presidency in 2016. Who's on first? Is it Ted Cruz? Is it Rand Paul? Is it Donald Trump, God forbid? Is it Scott Walker? Is it Jeb Bush? Is it any one of a cast of thousands? Okay, I exaggerate. 15, but still, 15 candidates? Come on. Who is the current head of the Republican Party? A lot of people are trying to make that claim. John Boehner might make that claim, right? He's Speaker of the House. That's kind of a big deal. Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, kind of a big deal. They all have claims. They all have claims. No one is definitive. So you get a little bit, it gets a little chaotic, but also in some ways small d democratic when you don't have the White House, because then there's a bit of a power vacuum and multiple candidates vie for that role as party leader. Finally, and very briefly, let's talk about what's called the two presidencies thesis. We've made some reference to that before. This is the idea that there are, in a sense, two American presidencies. One of them is the foreign policy presidency, and in that particular area, the president is unquestionably dominant by and large, by dint of their role as commander-in-chief of the military, by their constitutional authority to negotiate treaties with other nations. No question about it, right? But in domestic policy, in things involving things like perhaps questions about healthcare policy or policies involving the environment or policies dealing with labor issues. Here, I think Congress is much more assertive, much more significant politically, much more likely to combat the president, to compete with the president for supremacy. So I think in domestic policy, Congress and the president are pretty balanced, 50-50. Sometimes the president has the edge, sometimes Congress has the edge, like now perhaps. But in foreign policy, I think it's pretty clear. If in domestic policy it's 50-50, in foreign policy maybe it's more like 80-20. So some will say there's a distinction there. The court, back in 1936, I should mention this, the court in 1936 issued a decision called U.S. v. Curtis Wright, in which they held ultimately that the president in foreign policy has certain inherent powers that accrue to the president by nature of being president, as the sole representative of the nation in foreign affairs. That's worrisome to me, because what does it suggest, and really state, is that in general we have a government of enumerated powers, right? If the president has a power, it must be found in Article 2. If Congress has a power, it must be found in Article 1, or it's unconstitutional. In U.S. v. Curtis Wright, the court goes a further step than that, and they say, look, in foreign policy, the president has certain unenumerated powers that are inherent to the office, that don't require language in Article 2, right? It unmoors the president in foreign policy from Article 2 language. That to me is worrisome. I mean, I get it in a sense, you know, that in some ways the argument has some logic to it. But if you follow it out to its conclusion, it's worrisome, right? Because it does seem to violate the core American principle that we are a government of enumerated powers. And we'll leave it at that. I think we've done a nice job with the presidency. It took us a little while. We'll be moving on next to talk about the federal bureaucracy and then the Nevada executive.